Tonight, all about the law. Now, I bet this sounds familiar. Major new developments in the Russia probe and new information that could help Bob Mueller's obstruction case. Then, the legal storm surrounding Stormy Daniels. Porn star's attorney playing hardball, but President Trump isn't making a peep. That's unusual to say the least here. So why is Trump clamming up? Also, the local leader who wants to confiscate guns from people deemed too dangerous to have them. But how exactly would it work? Who gets to decide? And is it even legal? We've got a panel of attorneys here to hash it all out. Evening, everybody, and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French, and thank you for joining us this Wednesday evening. Well, we begin tonight with the Russia probe. Now, the New York Times reporting that Trump's former lead lawyer, John Dowd, he discussed pardons with both Michael Flynn and Paul Manafort, and that came as special counsel Bob Mueller was building his case against both of those gentlemen. Now, that is leading to a whole lot of speculation that Dowd was offering pardons to influence the decisions about whether or not the two of them would plead guilty and cooperate with the feds. What's left of Trump's legal team? They are responding. Jay Sekulow saying, "Never during the course of my representation of the president have I had any discussions of pardons of any individual involved in this report." Ty Cobb, he said, "I have only been asked about pardons by the press and have routinely responded on the record that no pardons are under discussion or under consideration at the White House." Now, that brings us to Rick Gates. He, the former close associate of Manafort and also a top aide during the Trump campaign. Gates, he could be a key piece in the Mueller probe. Court filing by Mueller says Gates had ties to Russian intelligence in 2016. If you forget, that's the year of the election. And the probe now focusing on whether the Trump campaign assisted the Kremlin's interference. Well, to help us with this and more is former federal prosecutor Roland Riopelle. He joins us to get into that and also Mueller's strategy. First, Roland, let's get into the pardons, what's allowed and what's not allowed. Any good attorney, I guess, is going to look at all the possible options to act on the best interest of their client. Is merely talking about pardons with potentially some of the principles, meaning, you know, in this case, you know, you got two guys that potentially, you know, with both Flynn here and Manafort that could be in some trouble here, is merely even having the conversation in their company crossing some red line or not?
Probably not, Richard. It would really come down to exactly what words were used. It seems to me very unlikely that Mr. Dowd would be so foolish as to have said to either Mr. Flynn or Mr. Manafort, "Look, clam up, we're going to pardon you later." If he said something that stupid, yes, you could be in trouble. You could have a real problem there. Because you'd be tampering with a witness.
Well, let me get into another who for a moment. Yeah, but if I could, Roland, let's say it was the president, okay? Let's say there's some communique where he says, "Hey, Flynn, you know, whatever you do, don't play ball with Mueller here. I'll take care of you. We'll talk pardons down the line." Can a president have that kind of extemporaneous conversation without going into the world of obstruction?
That would be pretty tough. That would be pretty tough, frankly. That kind of conversation could itself be a separate example of witness tampering or obstruction of justice. It would come down to the specific words and exactly what was said, but it could potentially be a witness tampering or obstruction if it was understood that the deal is you don't cooperate and I'll pardon you.
And we should be clear, at this point, the Times, and I recommend people check out the story for themselves, they're not attributing a specific name, whether it be the president or his counsel or any of his counsel, with having any of these conversations. It was just that the subject of pardons came up. The who and I guess the location of it matters. Now, you made a different point off air, which was just because somebody gets pardoned, or if they get pardoned, doesn't eliminate them as a potential witness or let alone exposure. Can you explain?
Yes. That's why I think this strategy of pardoning early was abandoned, because it really wouldn't have done Mr. Trump much help. Frankly, he could pardon somebody Mr. Mueller can subpoena them to the grand jury the next day. Once a pardon's been granted, there's no Fifth Amendment right to assert to try to block the grand jury proceeding or the testimony, and the witness must testify. The witness is under oath, and if the witness lies in that testimony, that's a new crime that hasn't been pardoned before, and Mr. Mueller can bring the perjury charge. And he can effectively, by gathering evidence using the grand jury, force the accurate and true testimony out of the witnesses, even if they have been pardoned.
So in a perverse way, Roland, in layman's terms, let's say, again, I'm doing a hypothetical, Trump were to pardon Flynn. Well, in a strange way, that's only incentivizing Flynn to be a complete cooperating witness, because at this point he faces no criminal exposure. The only way he'll get in trouble is if he lies. So he's incentivized to tell the truth.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. And that's why I don't think there were pardons early on. I think if there are going to be pardons, they'll come very late in the game, and it'll be people like Donald Jr. and Jared Kushner.
Let's talk about Mr. Gates here, because so many names have been thrown out as characters in this ongoing play. But Gates's participation and what we learned today from the Mueller folks in terms of what supposedly some of his testimony has been to them, talk about the importance of that, because a lot of people said if Manafort's Batman, he's his Robin here, and he was privy to all this stuff.
Yeah, I think that getting Mr. Gates into the government team was a big deal for Mr. Mueller. Mr. Gates, who was Paul Manafort's right-hand man for years and years, knows where all those bodies are buried. He can, make the case that's been brought against Manafort already very much stronger. And he worked very closely in the White House with Trump after Manafort was gone. So he was there when lots was going on in the White House that Mr. Mueller is looking at very closely, and he may be giving some very devastating evidence to Mr. Mueller about conduct inside the White House.
And again, the timing and the play are significant. We're talking about the Russians here specifically, at least if we believe from today's headline, potentially some of the folks involved in the Russian intelligence agency, and obviously the oligarchs. And we're talking 2016. It's not 2013 or 14 with Manafort's interest in Ukraine. This is now either right in the heart of the campaign and the election here, or even potentially in the aftermath.
Exactly correct. It's right. The timeline there is very bad in terms of Mr. Gates' close involvement with Mr. Trump. It's during the latter part of the campaign where all the activity with Russia is going on that we know about, and it's immediately after Trump's election. Gates stays on and continues to work closely in the White House for some significant time period after that, when Mr. Trump is, for example, meeting with Ambassador Kislyak from Russia and bragging about firing Jim Comey. Mr. Gates is around the White House at that point. There may be some connections there, and Mr. Gates knows them.
Finally, you've been great explaining, where, as it relates to collusion as well as obstruction. But imagine there's a big bulletin board here. It seems that, like we've always seen in those procedural dramas where all these lines eventually lead up to the person at the top of a crime family. In many ways, Roland, isn't this how this investigation, this prosecution's going, that they work almost up in a pyramid, and that's how it seems to be going, flipping up and up and up?
Yes, and all roads seem to lead to Donald Trump. That's really what's happening here. From the very first, Richard, with all of the false statements about, nobody ever talked to Russia, we never heard of Russia, what's Russia? So many people were making these false statements, and that kind of blanket falsehood throughout a large group typically, in my experience, comes from the top. Somebody at the top ordered everybody to lie about their connections to Russia, and the somebody at the top here seems like it has to be Donald Trump. That seems to be the person who had to be ordering everybody, you gotta lie about the connections to Russia. And those are the lies that got everybody in trouble.
And this thing just keeps building and building upon itself. Roland, as always, man, thank you so much for the time. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, pleasure to be with you, Richard.
All right, coming up next. Now, you think representing the president, I don't care any president, that would be a dream job and publicity exposure that any attorney, let alone law firm, would die for. Well, Donald Trump apparently doesn't fit that criteria. We are talking about unbelievable amounts of both attorneys and law firms that say thanks but no thanks when asked to represent him. We'll break into that and much more right after this.